The wreath had taken her 3 days. Not because it was difficult, but because she kept stopping, adjusting one ribbon, stepping back, remembering another Christmas. Another version of life where everything felt certain. Margaret stood in her kitchen, her fingers gently weaving a deep burgundy ribbon through the pine branches. The scent of fresh pine filled the air, mixing with cinnamon from the tea cooling beside her. It smelled like memory. It smelled like home. It smelled like Christmas. She smiled softly. "This is how your grandmother used to do it," she whispered to no one in particular, her fingers slowing as the past brushed against her heart. She had learned this at 9 years old. Back when her mother would stand behind her, guiding her hands gently, saying, "Take your time, Maggie. The beauty is in the care." And Margaret had carried that lesson into everything, her cooking, her home, her motherhood. Especially her motherhood. Her phone rang. She looked down and her face lit up instantly. Daniel. Even now, at 63 years old, seeing his name still made her heart do that same small, impossible thing, like it was expanding and folding all at once. She wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. Not long. But enough. "Hey, Mom." Carrot voice. Measured. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. "I was just finishing the Christmas wreath," she said warmly. "I found that same burgundy ribbon your grandmother used to use. Remember how?" "Mom, I need to talk to you about Christmas." The words settled heavily between them. Margaret slowly sat down at the kitchen table. "Okay." Another pause. "Natalie and we've decided to do something different this year." Margaret waited. She had learned, over the years, that silence often told the truth faster than words. "We're renting a house in the mountains," he continued. "In Asheville. It's big, really nice. Her parents are flying in, and some of her colleagues. It's going to be a full week." "That sounds lovely," Margaret said gently, but she didn't smile anymore. "The thing is," Daniel hesitated, "it's going to be a pretty sophisticated group." Margaret blinked. "I see. There's going to be a private chef some nights. Reservations at really high-end places. It's just different." Different. Such a simple word. Such a cruel one. "I don't think our usual Christmas would really fit," he added quietly. "You know, the casserole, the traditional setup." Margaret turned her gaze toward the window. A red cardinal had landed on the branch outside. Unapologetic. Alive against the cold gray sky. She asked slowly, "That you don't want me to come?" Silence. "Longer this time. Maybe we keep it small this year. Just coffee and gifts on the 23rd. Before we leave." Coffee and gifts. On the 2030, 3 years of Christmas, reduced to that. Margaret's fingers curled slightly on the table. "I understand," she said softly, because what else could she say? How do you respond when someone you raised with love suddenly finds that love inconvenient? "It's not personal, Mom," Daniel added quickly. "It's just you know how Natalie is." Margaret smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Les," she said. "I suppose I do." They said goodbye shortly after. She placed the phone down carefully. The house felt quieter. Not empty. Just smaller. Margaret sat there for a long time. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain wasn't sharp. It was something deeper. Something quieter. It was the feeling of being gently erased. The next morning, Margaret woke up early. Not out of habit. Out of restlessness. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the Christmas tree would go. For years, that corner had been the center of everything. Laughter, gifts, music, Daniel's childhood voice echoing through the house. Now it felt like a question. What do you do when the life you built no longer includes you? She picked up the phone, not to call Daniel, but to call Ruth. "Hello. Ruth," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Are you busy for Christmas?" There was a pause. Then Ruth laughed softly. "Margaret, I haven't been busy for Christmas in years." Margaret took a breath. "Then let's change that." It started small. Just an idea. A dinner. But ideas have a way of growing when they are built from something real. Margaret called Carol, Her former colleague who had lost her husband that summer. Yes. Carol said immediately. Oh my God, yes. She called the young couple down the street, Marcus and Priya. We don't want to impose. Priya said hesitantly. You wouldn't be. Margaret replied. You'd be the reason. She reached out to a student from the literacy program Ram. Ram, I haven't had a real Christmas in 3 years. He said quietly. Then it's time you did, she answered. One by one, the table began to fill. Not with perfection, not with sophistication, but with people, real people. People who needed a place to belong. Margaret cooked the way she always had. Slowly, carefully, with intention. The ham glazed in brown sugar and cloves. The scalloped potatoes with just a touch of nutmeg. The cookies from her mother's recipe. And the chicken, her famous chicken. Brined for 2 days in lemon, rosemary, and salt. Because some things cannot be rushed. Because love takes time. On Christmas Day the house was full. Laughter echoed through the walls. Voices overlapped. Stories unfolded. Jerome stood in the kitchen, completely focused on stirring cranberry sauce, like it was the most important job in the world. Priya ran her fingers over the handwritten recipe cards, her eyes soft with memory. Ruth adjusted candles with serious precision. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching it all. And for the first time since that phone call, she didn't feel full, she felt full. At 4:15 p.m. her phone rang. Daniel. She stepped outside into the cold. Hi sweetheart. Mom. His voice was different this time, not careful, not distant. Just quiet. It doesn't feel like Christmas here, he admitted. Margaret looked out at her yard glowing softly in the fading light. I'm sorry to hear that, she said gently. I keep thinking about your chicken, he added. She smiled. It's in the fridge, she said. You can come by tomorrow. A pause. Then softly. I'd like that. Margaret walked back inside. The house was warm, alive. 17 people. 17 stories. 17 reasons to believe that family is not something you lose. It's something you build. She picked up the pitcher and began refilling glasses. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this was hers. And it was more than enough. The house didn't feel empty after everyone left. That was the first surprise. Margaret stood in her kitchen long after the last guest had gone. Her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. The candles had burned low, their soft glow flickering against the walls. The scent of rosemary and sugar still lingered in the air, woven into the very fabric of the evening. 17 people had filled this house. 17. And yet now, in the quiet, she didn't feel the usual ache that followed gatherings, the one that whispered it's over and now you're alone again. No. This quiet felt complete. Like a deep breath after a long, meaningful conversation. She walked slowly to the sink, rolling up her sleeves. Plates were stacked high, glasses scattered. Crumbs still clinging to the tablecloth. Evidence of life. Of laughter. She didn't rush. She washed one plate at a time, letting the warm water run over her hands. Replaying moments from the day. Jerome laughing, really laughing, for the first time she had ever seen. Priya's eyes lighting up as she spoke about her grandmother. Ruth wiping tears while pretending she wasn't. Carol sitting at the table long after dessert, not wanting to leave. Margaret smiled to herself. They didn't want to go. She whispered softly. And something inside her, something that had been quietly bruised for weeks, began to heal. The next morning. Sunlight slipped gently through the curtains. Margaret woke earlier than usual, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the house. Then she remembered. Daniel is coming. The thought didn't bring anxiety. It didn't bring excitement either. It brought something steadier. Clarity. She got up, tied her robe, and moved to the kitchen. The refrigerator still held the remains of yesterday, containers filled with leftovers. Carefully wrapped dishes. The last of the cookies tucked into a tin. She opened the fridge and looked at the chicken. Still there. She smiled faintly. Of course it is. Margaret moved with quiet purpose. She reheated the chicken slowly, letting it warm through without drying. She placed the scalloped potatoes into the oven, covered with foil. She set the table, not the full table from yesterday. Not 17 plates, just 2, no, 3. She paused, her hand hovering over the plates. Then she added the third, not out of obligation, but out of hope. At 12:17 p.m. she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Margaret didn't rush to the door. She dried her hands carefully, smoothed her sweater, and walked over at her usual pace. When she opened it, Daniel was standing there. For a moment neither of them spoke. He looked tired. Not physically. Something deeper than that. Like someone who had been somewhere that didn't quite fit. "Mom," he said quietly. "Sweetheart." He stepped inside slowly, his eyes moving through the house. The tree, the garland. The faint scent of yesterday still lingering. "You kept everything up," he said. "I always do," she replied gently. He nodded, as if remembering something he hadn't about in a long time. They sat at the table together. The food was simple this time. No crowd. No noise. Just warmth. Daniel took a bite of the chicken. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he closed his eyes briefly. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's it." Margaret watched him, her expression calm. "What's it?" she asked. He looked at her. This is what Christmas tastes like." Silence settled between them. But this time, it wasn't heavy, it was honest. "I'm sorry," Daniel said suddenly. The words came out quickly, like they had been waiting just beneath the surface. Margaret didn't interrupt. "I didn't think it would matter that much," he continued. "I thought we'd do something different, and it would be fine. Better even." He let out a small, humorless laugh. "It wasn't." Margaret folded her hands gently in her lap. "What happened?" she asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "It was perfect," he said. "Technically. The house was beautiful. The food was expensive. Everything was impressive." He paused, but no one was really there. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he struggled for the right words. "People were there but they weren't present. Everyone was trying to be something, say the right thing, impress someone." He shook his head. "It felt like a performance." Margaret listened quietly. "No one laughed the way people laughed here." He added softly. "No one told stories. No one spilled anything. No one stayed too long because they didn't want the night to end." He looked down at his plate. "I didn't realize what we had until I didn't have it." Margaret let the words sit between them. Not to punish him, but to let him hear himself. After a moment she stood up and walked to the counter. She picked up something small, wrapped in a simple napkin. She placed it in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." Daniel unfolded the napkin carefully. Inside was a cookie, a small star-shaped cookie. His cookie cutter. The one he had given her when he was 7. He stared at it for a long time. "You still have this?" he asked quietly. Margaret smiled. "I've used it every year." His throat tightened. "I didn't know that." "I know," she said gently. Daniel swallowed hard. "I thought," he hesitated. "I thought you were just stuck in your ways." Margaret sat back down across from him. "I am," she said simply. He looked up, surprised. "But not because I don't know anything else," she continued. "Because I know what matters." Her voice was calm, steady. "Tradition isn't about repetition, Daniel. It's about memory. It's about creating something that people can come back to." She gestured lightly around the room. "This isn't about casseroles." He gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I know. It's about belonging," she added. Daniel nodded slowly. "I saw the pictures," he said after a moment. "What pictures?" "Ruth posted some online," he explained. 17 people, right?" Margaret laughed softly. 17, yes. He shook his head in disbelief. "You replaced me with 17 people." Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "I didn't replace you," she said. "I made room." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. "I want to come next year," Daniel said quietly. Margaret studied his face. Not suspicious. Not guarded. Just thoughtful. "Next year is a long time away," she said. "I know," he replied. "I don't want to miss it again." She nodded. "Then don't." There was a knock at the door. Both of them turned. Margaret smiled faintly. I think that's your third place sighting. Daniel frowned slightly. She stood up and opened the door. Natalie stood there, holding a small box, looking uncertain. Hey, she said softly. Margaret stepped aside. Come in. Natalie walked in slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The tree. The table. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Margaret nodded. Would you like some lunch? Natalie hesitated. Then, almost like she was letting go of something invisible. Yes. The three of them sat at the table. And for the first time, there was no performance, no expectations, just food, just conversation, just space. Natalie took a bite of the chicken. Her eyes widened slightly. This is incredible, she said. Margaret smiled. It takes 2 days. Natalie looked at her. 2 days, Wes. Natalie nodded slowly. As it should, she whispered. And in that moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to begin again. After they left, Margaret stood once more in her quiet home. But now, the quiet felt different. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Because she finally understood something she had spent a lifetime building. Love doesn't become stronger when it's rejected. It becomes stronger when it's shared. And the table she built would always have room. After Daniel and Natalie left, the house grew quiet again. But this time, Margaret didn't move right away. She stood by the door for a long moment, her hand still resting on the handle, as if the warmth they had brought with them hadn't fully faded yet. Outside, the evening had settled in softly. The sky was deep blue, the kind that only appears in winter, when the world feels both still and infinite at the same time. She exhaled slowly. Not a heavy sigh. Not relief. Just release. Then she turned back toward her home. The living room still carried the memory of yesterday. A blanket draped over the arm of the sofa where Ruth had sat. A glass forgot on the side table, Jerome's, she realized. One of the candles burned low. Its flame small but stubborn. Margaret walked over and gently straightened the blanket. Her fingers smoothing the fabric like she used to do when Daniel was little and had fallen asleep mid-movie. Some habits never leave you. Some love never changes shape. It only changes where it rests. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. For years this had been her place. The place where she waited. Waited for Daniel to come home from school. Waited for phone calls. Waited for holidays, waited for life to happen. But tonight, she wasn't waiting. That realization came quietly, but when it did, it settled deep. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled to herself. I'm not waiting anymore. And somehow that felt like freedom. The next few days passed gently. Ruth came by on the 27th with leftover pie, and stayed for 2 hours longer than she intended. You've started something, you know, she said, her voice thoughtful. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Have I? Yes, Ruth replied. People are already talking about it. Carol told me she hasn't felt that kind of Christmas in years. Priya said it reminded her of home. Jerome, she smiled softly. Jerome told the program coordinator. It was the first time he didn't feel ill during the holidays. Margaret looked down at her hands. She hadn't thought about it that way. I was just making dinner, she said quietly. Ruth shook her head. No, Margaret, she said gently. You were making space. That word stayed with her, space. Not just a physical table. Not just food. A place where people didn't have to prove anything. Didn't have to perform. Didn't have to be anything other than who they were. And suddenly Margaret understood something she hadn't seen before. All those years she hadn't just been cooking Christmas. She had been creating a place where people could belong. She just hadn't realized how rare that had become. On New Year's Eve, her phone rang again. Daniel. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. This time his voice was lighter, not perfect, but real. I was thinking, he said. About tradition. Margaret listened. I think I forgot that traditions aren't about oppressing people, he continued. They're about remembering who you are. She smiled softly. That's a good thing to remember. There was a pause. Then, Natalie wants your recipe. Margaret blinked. My recipe? For the chicken? He said. She's been talking about it all week. Margaret laughed quietly. Well, she said, it's not very complicated. Write it down anyway. Daniel replied. Please. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a pen and an index card. The same kind her mother had used. The same kind she had used for decades. Her handwriting wasn't as neat as it once was. But it was steady. She wrote slowly. Roast chicken, brine for 2 days, pat dry. Season well, roast until skin turns deep golden, don't rush. She paused. Then added one more line at the bottom. Make it for people you love. She looked at the card for a long moment. Then smiled. January came and went. Then February, life settled into its quieter rhythm again. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But permanently. Margaret found herself reaching out more. Inviting people for dinner, not just on holidays. Calling Ruth just to talk. Checking in on Carol. Asking Priya to teach her one of her grandmother's recipes. Even Jerome stopped by sometimes, usually with questions about school. But he always stayed for tea. The table didn't disappear after Christmas, it just continued. One afternoon in early March, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find Daniel standing there. Unannounced. She raised an eyebrow slightly. This is a surprise. He smiled. Is it okay? She stepped aside. It always is. They sat in the kitchen together. No holiday. No occasion. Just an ordinary day. Dana looked around the room, taking it in. You've been busy? He said. Margaret tilted her head. With what? He gestured lightly. This. People coming by, you doing things. She smiled faintly. I suppose I have. He nodded slowly. It feels different, he said. Margaret considered that. Yes, she said. It does. After a moment Daniel spoke again. I used to think. He hesitated. I used to think Christmas was something you made happen. Decorations, food planning. Margaret listened. But now I think. He looked at her. It's something you create space for. She smiled. That's exactly right. He leaned back in his chair. I think I was embarrassed, he admitted quietly. Margaret didn't react immediately. Off what? She asked gently. Off simplicity, he said. Off things that weren't impressive. He shook his head slightly. I thought I needed more. Something bigger, better. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. And now? Daniel looked around the kitchen. At the worn table. At the recipe box. At the quiet warmth that didn't try to be anything more than it was. Now I think I just needed this. Margaret stood up and walked to the counter. She opened the recipe box and pulled out the index card she had written. Daniel took it carefully. He read it once. Then again. His eyes lingered on the last line. Make it for people you love. He swallowed. I will, he said softly. That spring something small but meaningful began to grow. Not a big announcement. Not a grand change, just choices. Daniel and Natalie started hosting small dinners. Nothing elaborate, just a few friends, simple meals. Real conversations. Sometimes they called Margaret for advice. Sometimes they didn't need to. Because they were beginning to understand. And when December came again, Margaret didn't wait for an invitation, she didn't wonder what would happen. She simply started preparing. The wreath, the ribbon, the recipes. Because Christmas, she had learned, was not something you were given. It was something you built. A week before Christmas, Daniel called. Mom. Yes. We were thinking, he paused. Would you mind if we did Christmas at your place this year? Margaret smiled. Of course not. He added. We were hoping to invite a few people. Friends. Maybe Natalie's parents too. Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see it. There's room, she said. There was always room. On Christmas Day the house was full again. Not exactly the same as before. But not meant to be. Some faces were familiar, some were new. Natalie moved comfortably to the kitchen this time, no longer hesitant. Daniel stood beside Margaret, carving the chicken, asking questions, learning. And at one point Margaret stepped back. Just for a moment. And watched. The laughter, the noise, the warmth, the life. And she realized something quietly. but with absolute certainty. This wasn't just her Christmas anymore. It had become something bigger. Something shared. Something that would continue even without her someday. And instead of sadness, she felt peace. That night, as the candles burned low once again, Margaret sat at the table, surrounded by people who had chosen to be there. Not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but out of love. And she thought about that phone call a year ago. The one that had broken something in her. The one that had made her feel small. And she smiled. Because sometimes, the moment that breaks you is the moment that shows you what you were meant to build instead. Winter softened into spring, and spring slowly gave way to summer. Time moved the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. But inside Margaret's home, something had shifted so deeply that even time seemed to move differently around it. The table was no longer something she prepared once a year. It had become a rhythm. On a warm afternoon in June, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, settling in soft golden patches across the floor. Margaret stood at the counter, slicing peaches for a simple dessert. The door was unlocked. It often was now. A light knock sounded anyway. "Come in," she called. Jerome stepped inside, holding a notebook under his arm. "Miss Margaret," he said with a grin, "I brought my essay." She turned, smiling. "Well then," she said, "you'd better sit down and let me read it." He dropped into a chair at the table, the same table where, months ago, he had sat nervously stirring cranberry sauce like it was a test he might fail. Now he looked different, more certain, more at ease. Margaret wiped her hands and took the notebook, adjusting her glasses. "What's it about this time?" she asked. Jerome shrugged lightly. "Family." Margaret paused. Then she nodded and began to read. She read slowly. Not because she needed to, but because she respected words. Because she knew what it meant to put your heart into something and hand it. Halfway through she stopped. "Jerome," she said softly. He shifted in his seat. "Yeah. This part," she tapped the page. "Where you wrote family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who opens the door when you knock." He looked down, a little embarrassed. "I wasn't sure if that sounded too much." Margaret closed the notebook gently. "It sounds exactly right." Later that afternoon, after Jerome left, Margaret stood at the sink washing the peach bowl. She found herself thinking about that sentence. Who opens the door when you knock? She dried her hands slowly. For years, she had believed that love was something you gave and hoped would be returned. But now she understood something deeper. Love wasn't a transaction. It was a choice. And sometimes, the people who chose you were not the ones you expected. In July came over with a small tin box. "I want to try something," she said, her eyes bright. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, my grandmother's recipe," Priya explained. "Well, not exactly. I had to recreate it from memory." She opened the tin. Inside were small spice packets, each carefully labeled. Margaret leaned closer, inhaling the scent. Warm, complex, alive. "How many spices?" she asked. Priya smiled. 22. Margaret laughed softly. "Well," she said, tying on her apron, "we'd better get started." They cooked together for hours. Not quickly. Not efficiently. Priya told stories as she worked about her grandmother, about the way she used to measure spices without looking, about how she believed food carried memory. Margaret listened. Really listened. And somewhere between the stirring and the tasting and the adjusting, something beautiful happened. The recipe came back to life. Not exactly the same, but real enough, close enough, meaningful enough. When they finally sat down to eat, Priya took one bite and her eyes filled with tears. "It's not perfect," she said. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand gently over hers. "It doesn't have to be." By August, the table had hosted more stories than Margaret could count. Carol came every other Sunday now. Ruth still showed up unannounced, usually with something sweet and something to say. Even Daniel and Natalie visited more often, not just for holidays but for ordinary evenings. And that, Margaret thought, was the real miracle. Not that people came, but that they wanted to stay. One evening in early September, as the air began to cool just slightly, Daniel stood in the kitchen watching Margaret cook. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, thoughtful. "You don't measure anything," he said. Margaret glanced at him. "Of course I do." He shook his head. "No, you don't. Not really," she smiled. "I measure what matters." He tilted his head. "And what's that?" Margaret stirred the pot slowly. "Time," she said. "Attention." She looked at him. "You can't rush those." Daniel nodded quietly. After dinner, they sat outside on the porch. The sky was fading into that soft evening blue, and the air carried the faint scent of approaching autumn. "Mom," Daniel said after a while, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "Were you really hurt last Christmas?" Margaret didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to answer honestly. "Yes," she said finally. Daniel looked down. "I thought so. But," she added gently, "I'm glad it happened." He looked up, surprised. "Glad?" She nodded. "Because it showed me something I hadn't seen before." "What's that?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "That I had built something strong enough to grow beyond just us." Daniel swallowed. "I didn't deserve that kind of grace." Margaret smiled softly. "Grace isn't about what you deserve." Autumn arrived fully in October. The leaves turned gold and red, falling slowly across the yard. Margaret found herself back in the craft store one afternoon. The same one. The same aisles. The same quiet hum of people preparing for a season that meant something different to each of them. She walked to the ribbon section. Her fingers moved over the familiar textures. And then, she found it. The burgundy ribbon. She held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the softness, the memory. The meaning woven into something so simple. A year ago, this ribbon had been part of a moment that broke her heart. Now, it felt like something else entirely. She placed it gently into her basket. That evening, she began the wreath again. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her hands moved with quiet confidence. Weaving the ribbon through the pine, shaping something beautiful out of something ordinary. The radio played softly in the background. The house smelled like memory again, but this time, it wasn't just the past, it was the present. As she worked, her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "We're thinking of inviting a few more people this Christmas. Is that okay?" Margaret smiled. She typed back. "There's always room." She set the phone down and continued weaving. The wreath took shape slowly, carefully. Just like everything that mattered. And as the final ribbon fell into place, Margaret stepped back and looked at it. Not perfect, not flawless, but full of meaning, full of memory, full of love. That night, as she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Margaret paused at the doorway of her living room. The space was quiet. Still. But not empty. Never empty. Because now she understood something she hadn't fully known before. What you build with love doesn't disappear when people leave, it stays. It grows. It becomes something others carry forward. And somewhere, deep inside, she felt it. That quiet, steady certainty that had taken a lifetime to earn. She had not been replaced, she had not been left behind. She had simply made space. And in that space, something beautiful had learned how to live. By the time December returned, Margaret didn't feel the same quiet uncertainty she had carried the year before. There was no question hanging in the air. No waiting. No wondering if she would be included. Because something inside her had settled to a truth that no one could take away. She no longer needed an invitation to create something meaningful. The first frost came early that year. Thin and delicate, it covered the grass like a memory, soft, quiet, and impossible to hold. Margaret stood at her kitchen window that morning. Her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, watching the light stretch slowly across the yard. The corner where the Christmas tree would go was already cleared. Not out of habit but out of intention. Behind her, on the table, sat the wreath, the same deep burgundy ribbon. Carefully woven, carefully chosen. But this time it didn't carry pain. It carried something stronger. Understanding. The phone rang. Margaret glanced down. Daniel. She smiled, but it was different now, not the kind that depended on what he might say. Steady, grounded. Sweetheart. Hi, Mom, his voice came through, warm, familiar. Are you busy? Just thinking about where to put the tree. He laughed softly. You always say that like it's a complicated decision. It is. She replied lightly, placement matters. There was a pause. But not the kind that hurt. The kind that felt comfortable. Mom. Daniel said. Natalie and I were talking and we wanted to ask you something. Margaret leaned against the counter. I'm listening. We were thinking. He continued. What if we made your Christmas the Christmas, every year? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was unsure. But because she understood what that question really meant. It wasn't about location, it wasn't about tradition. It was about returning. Choosing. Belonging. That sounds lovely, she said gently. And she meant it. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly came alive again. Not in a rush, not in a frenzy. But in layers. The tree went up first. Margaret took her time with it, unwrapping each ornament like it was something sacred. Daniel came over that afternoon. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. Where does this one go? He asked, holding up a small, uneven ornament painted in bright, childish colors. Margaret smiled. You made that when you were 5. He looked at it more carefully. It's not very good, it's perfect, she said. And she meant that too. Natalie arrived later, carrying a box. I brought something, she said, a little hesitant. Margaret opened it. Inside were simple white candles. Elegant but not extravagant. I thought, maybe these could go on the table. Natalie offered. Margaret looked at her, then at the candles. They're beautiful, she said warmly. Natalie smiled, relieved. It was a small moment. But it mattered. As the days passed, more people, not all at once, but steadily. Ruth with her familiar laughter. Carol, carrying a new recipe she wanted to try. Priya and Marcus, bringing spices and stories. Jerome, who now walked into the house like it had always been his. Even Natalie's parents arrived a few days before Christmas. There had been a time when the idea made Margaret nervous. But not anymore. Because she understood something now. You don't shrink your table to fit people. On Christmas Eve the house was full. Not crowded. Full. The kind of full that feels intentional. That feels alive. Margaret stood in the kitchen tying her apron, when she felt someone beside her. Natalie, can I help? She asked. Margaret handed her a bowl. Stir this, she said. Natalie nodded. Like this? Exactly. They stood side by side in comfortable silence. And for the first time, there was no distance between them. No quiet judgment. No unspoken tension. Just two people sharing a space. In the living room, Daniel was showing Jerome having the garland properly. No, you have to leave a little slack, he was saying. Otherwise it looks stiff. Jerome laughed. I didn't know garland had rules. It does in this house, Daniel replied. Margaret paused in the doorway, watching them. A year ago, that moment wouldn't have existed. And that realization didn't make her sad, it made her grateful. Christmas morning arrived softly. The kind of morning that feels sacred without needing to say why. Margaret woke before everyone else. She always did. She moved quietly through the house. Turning on the lights, checking the food, adjusting small details that no one else would notice, but that she knew mattered. Because love often lives in the smallest things. By afternoon, the table was set. Larger this time, more plates. More stories waiting to unfold. Margaret stood at the head of the table, looking at it. The red tablecloth. The candles. The food she had prepared with the same care she had given for decades. But this time it felt different. Not heavier. Not harder. Just shared. People gathered slowly, taking their places, filling the space with conversation and warmth. Daniel sat near the center. Natalie beside him. Her parents across the table, curious but open. Jerome next to Ruth, already laughing at something. Priya and Marcus close by, adding their quiet presence. Margaret looked around, 17 again. Maybe more, she had lost count. And for once, she didn't need to. Before they began eating, Daniel stood up. The room quieted slightly. He looked around the table. Then at his mother. "I want to say something," he began. Margaret felt a small shift in her chest. Not fear. Just attention. "A year ago," he said, "I thought Christmas was about creating something impressive." He paused. "I was wrong." The room was still. He glanced at Margaret again. "My mom showed me that Christmas isn't about perfection. It's about presence." Margaret's eyes softened. "It's about this." He gestured around the table. "People who choose to be here. People who feel like they belong." His voice grew quieter. "And I almost missed that." No one spoke, no one needed to, because everyone understood. Margaret felt something rise in her chest, not pain, not sadness, something warmer, something fuller. She reached for her glass and lifted it slightly. "To the table," she said softly. They all raised their glasses. To the table. Dinner stretched long into the evening. Laughter filled every corner. Stories crossed over one another. Someone spilled something. Someone else told a joke that made no sense but still made everyone laugh. And Margaret. Margaret didn't stand in the doorway this time. She didn't watch from the edges, she sat. Right there. At the center of it all. Later that night, as the candles burned low and the last guests began to gather their things, Margaret stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold, sharp, but clean. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked up at the sky. For a moment, she thought about that phone call a year ago. The one that had made her feel small. The one that had made her question everything. And she smiled. Because now she understood something she hadn't understood then. Sometimes, what feels like rejection is actually redirection. Behind her, the door opened. Daniel stepped out. "Mom." "Yes." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on Christmas." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head gently. "I didn't do this for Christmas," she said. "I did this for people." He nodded. And in that moment he understood. But everything behind them. When Margaret went back inside, the house was quieter. But not empty. Never empty. Because what had been created here, what had been built with care, with patience, with love, it didn't end when the night did, it stayed. In the walls. In the memories. In the people who would carry it forward. The house was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that echoes. Not the kind that reminds you of what's missing. This quiet felt settled. Like something had found its place and decided to stay. Margaret stood in the living room the morning after Christmas, holding a small box of ornaments. One by one, she wrapped them carefully in tissue paper, the same way she had done for years. But slower this time. Not because she was tired, because she understood. Each ornament wasn't just decoration. It was a moment. A year. A memory that had once been small and had somehow become everything. She paused, holding the star-shaped cookie ornament Daniel had made decades ago. The paint had chipped slightly, the edges were uneven. Perfect. She smiled and placed it gently into the box. In the kitchen, the table was still set, not fully, but enough. A few glasses left behind. A folded napkin. A chair slightly pulled out, as if someone had just stood up and might come back any second. Margaret walked over and rested her hand on the table. She didn't rush to clean it. Not yet. Because she knew something now that she hadn't always known. You don't have to hurry to close something beautiful. You're allowed to sit with it, to let it linger. A soft knock came at the door. Margaret turned, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, Jerome stood there, hands in his pockets, looking slightly unsure. "Miss Margaret," he said. I hope I'm not interrupting." She smiled warmly. "You never are." He stepped inside slowly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "For yesterday. For all of it." Margaret tilted her head. "You already did that." "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I don't think I said it right." She waited. Jerome looked around the room. At the tree. At the table. At the quiet that still felt full. "I used to hate this time of year," he admitted. Margaret didn't interrupt. "I mean, really hate it. Everywhere you go, people talking about family, traditions, memories. He let out a small breath. I didn't have any of that. His voice softened. But now I do. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise, recognition. Good, she said gently. Jerome nodded. Yeah, he said. Good. They sat at the table together. Just the two of them. Margaret poured tea. Jerome wrapped his hands around the cup, like he always did. I was thinking, he said after a moment, about what you said once. Margaret raised an eyebrow. I say a lot of things. He smiled slightly. You said food isn't about being fancy. It's about making people feel like they belong. She nodded. That sounds like something I would say. He looked at her seriously. I think you do that without the food too. Margaret blinked. Jerome shrugged. Just, the way you listen. The way you make space. He paused. You don't make people feel like they're visiting. Margaret sat very still. Because that meant more than anything. After Jerome left, Margaret finally began clearing the table. Slowly, carefully, but something inside her had shifted again. Not in a big way. Not in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that mattered. Because she realized, what she had wouldn't depend on a day, or a season, or even a tradition. It lived in something much simpler. Consistency, care, presence. The days after Christmas faded gently into the new year. Decorations came down, the tree was taken apart. The house returned to its quieter shape. But the feeling didn't leave, it lingered. In small things, in ordinary moments. In January, Natalie called. Hi. Margaret, she said. Margaret smiled at the sound of her voice. Hi, Natalie. I was wondering, she hesitated. Would you mind teaching me the chicken recipe? Margaret leaned back slightly. I thought you already had it. I do, Natalie admitted, but I don't think the paper is the important part. Margaret smiled. No, she said softly. It isn't. The next weekend, Natalie stood in Margaret's kitchen, sleeves rolled up, looking both determined and slightly nervous. Okay, she said. Start from the beginning. Margaret handed her a lemon. First, she said. You don't rush. Natalie laughed. I'm starting to see a pattern here. Margaret smiled. Good. They worked side by side. Just like Margaret and her mother once had. Just like Margaret had always hoped, even when she didn't realize it. Natalie asked questions. Made mistakes. Learned slowly. And Margaret didn't correct everything. Because some things aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to be passed on. By February, Daniel and Natalie had started hosting their own small dinners. Nothing elaborate. Nothing sophisticated. Just real. They called Margaret after the first one. It wasn't perfect, Daniel said. Margaret smiled. It wasn't supposed to be. But people stayed. Natalie added, longer than we expected. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. That's how you know you're doing it right. Spring came again. Softly, quietly. Just like everything meaningful seemed to. Margaret found herself back at the kitchen table one afternoon. Her mother's recipe box open in front of her. She flipped through the cards slowly. Each one a story. Each one a piece of something that had lasted longer than it was ever meant to. She picked up a blank card. For a moment she just held it, then she began to write. Not a recipe. Not exactly something else. Christmas table, what matters. Take your time. Invite people who need a place, don't worry about perfection. Let people help, let people stay, make room. She paused, then added one final line. This is how love continues. She placed the card carefully into the box. Not at the front. Right at the back, right in the middle, where it belonged. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into its familiar quiet, Margaret sat by the window once more. The same place, the same view. But everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. She no longer measured her life by what she was given, or what she was denied. She measured it by what she created, what she shared, what she made possible for others.